Welcome to Cozy English. Tonight we are going to talk about money and goals and the complicated space between them. Money is one of those subjects that is everywhere in life and almost nowhere in polite conversation. We deal with it every day, and yet we are often strangely reluctant to discuss it honestly, to admit what we want, what we fear, what we have got wrong, and what we have slowly figured out. The stories tonight try to do that. They are about people making decisions, not always the right ones, often the interesting ones, about what they earn and spend and save and sacrifice and chase. And alongside the money, there are goals. The big ones and the quiet ones. The goals that were there all along and the ones that arrived by surprise. The goals that required money and the ones that turned out to have nothing to do with it. As you listen, let yourself sink into rest. The English is coming to you. You do not need to go to it. Just breathe and let the stories carry you. Before we begin, please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. We make these videos for English learners around the world, and every subscriber helps us keep going. Share us with a friend who is learning. Come back tomorrow night. We will be here. Now, the stories. Story 1. The Spreadsheet. For 3 years, every Sunday evening, Nina sat down with a cup of tea and updated her spreadsheet. The spreadsheet had been born out of a specific moment of reckoning, a Saturday morning when she had looked at her bank account and found it lower than she expected by an amount that was not ruinous, but was, she thought, the amount that a person spends when they are not paying attention. She had not been paying attention. She decided to pay attention. The spreadsheet tracked everything: income, fixed costs, variable costs, savings, the small and frequent purchases that turned out, when aggregated, to be not small at all. She had been surprised in the early months by the coffee and the lunches and the things bought online at 11 at night that had seemed at the time like nothing much. She was not naturally frugal. This was important to understand about herself. She enjoyed spending, not extravagantly, but freely, without calculation, with the ease of someone who has not yet had to calculate. The spreadsheet did not ask her to stop spending. It asked her to know what she was spending, and to decide if she agreed with the decisions her past self had made. Often, she did not agree. The adjustment was not dramatic. She did not give up things. She moved some things, ate lunch at her desk on Tuesdays and Thursdays rather than at the cafe around the corner, which saved a specific amount per month that she had decided she would rather direct somewhere else. She stopped the 3 subscription services she had forgotten she still had, which together cost more per month than she had estimated by a factor of 2. After a year, something had shifted. Not in her circumstances exactly. The number in the account was larger, but the more important shift was in her relationship to money, which had changed from something that happened to her into something she participated in. This was a small but significant distinction. She kept the spreadsheet for years, long after it had become less necessary. It had become a habit, and the habit had become a kind of practice, a Sunday ritual of looking honestly at the week and accounting for it before the next one started. Her friend Yara had asked once if it wasn't depressing, tracking everything so carefully. Nina had thought about it. "It's the opposite," she said. "When I didn't track it, I had a vague sense of not being in control. The tracking just made it real. Once it was real, I could do something about it." Story 2. The Loan. He had borrowed the money from his brother, and this had been, in several ways, a mistake. Not because his brother was a bad person to borrow from. His brother was generous and had not hesitated, but because the money had come without paperwork, without a repayment schedule, without the formal structure that protects a loan from becoming something else. What it had become, over the 2 years since Marcus had borrowed it, was a presence in the relationship. Not large, most of the time. Not discussed, almost ever. But there. He had intended to repay it within 6 months. This had been a reasonable intention at the time, and an incorrect prediction. The 6 months had extended, for reasons that were individually defensible. The car, then the flat deposit, then the months when work was slow, and which collectively had produced 2 years of the debt sitting between them, like something neither of them wanted to pick up and examine. His brother never mentioned it. This was, Marcus thought, either kindness or its own kind of pressure, and he was not always sure which. He repaid it on a Thursday. He transferred the money and then called his brother to tell him, which was strange. It would have been easier to simply send it and let the transfer speak for itself, but he felt, for reasons he couldn't entirely explain, that he needed to say it. "I've sent the money back," he said. "I'm sorry it took so long." There was a pause. His brother said, "You didn't need to call." "I know," Marcus said. "I wanted to." Another pause. His brother said, "Okay, thank you." They talked for a few more minutes about other things and then hung up, and Marcus sat for a while with the phone in his hand, thinking about the 2 years. He thought about what he would do differently. The paperwork, the schedule, the conversation at the beginning that should have been clearer about expectations and timeline. He thought about the way debt between family members carried an extra charge that debt between strangers or institutions did not. The charge of the relationship, of love, which made the whole thing harder in both directions. He did not borrow money from family again. When the question arose in future years in various forms, he said, not unkindly, not with drama, that he preferred to go another route. He had learned something from the 2 years that he did not want to learn a second time. Story 3. The Goal. When Priya was 26, she wrote a goal on a piece of paper and put it in a drawer. The goal was, buy a flat before 35. She had not told anyone about this. The goal felt too specific to say aloud, too vulnerable to the particular response that specific goals received, the well-meaning but slightly deflating response of people who wanted to protect you from disappointment by reminding you of the difficulty. She did not need to be reminded of the difficulty. She knew about the difficulty. She was writing the goal because she believed difficulty was not a reason not to try. She started saving the month she wrote the goal. Not dramatically, she did not move to a smaller flat or stop seeing her friends or impose a regime of deprivation on herself. She moved money into a savings account on the first of every month, before anything else happened to it, in an amount that was more than comfortable and less than punishing. She thought of the savings account as a second present she was making to her future self, alongside the present she was already making to her current self. Some years were harder than others. The year her heating broke, and the year she needed a new laptop, and the year she had 3 friends' weddings in the summer and spent more than she intended on gifts and travel and dresses. In those years, the amount she moved to the savings account was smaller. She did not stop. By the time she was 32, she had enough for a deposit. The purchase itself was less dramatic than the goal. It was paperwork and solicitors and surveys, and a great deal of waiting, and a week of genuine fear during the exchange process when she could not sleep properly. The keys, when they arrived, were smaller than she expected, and she held them in her hand in the estate agent's office, and felt something that was not quite what she had imagined, which was pure joy, It was something more mixed, more complex, more real than that. She went to the flat alone. She stood in the empty kitchen and the empty living room and the empty bedroom, and the sound of the flat was the sound of a place that was hers. She sat on the floor in the kitchen, the only room that had a window facing west, and watched the afternoon light change, and thought about the piece of paper in the drawer, and the 9 years between the writing and this. She texted her mother a photograph of the keys. Her mother called immediately, and they both cried a little, which neither of them had expected. The piece of paper is still in a drawer somewhere. She has not needed to read it again. She knows what it says. Story 4. The Raise. She had been going to ask for the raise for 4 months. The 4 months had contained a great number of reasons why this was not quite the right moment. Her manager had been busy. There had been a restructure. It had been the end of the quarter and then the beginning of the quarter. She had been on a project with a tight deadline, and it had not seemed right to ask in the middle of something demanding. She had noticed after the 4th month that the reasons were multiplying rather than resolving, and that this was a pattern worth interrupting. She asked Jess, who had negotiated her own pay twice, and who had the quality, useful in friends, of not letting people be dishonest with themselves. "What are you actually afraid of?" Jess said. Sarah thought, "That they'll say no," she said. "And if they say no?" "I don't know. I'll be embarrassed." "Will you?" Jess said. "Or will you just be someone who asked for a raise and was told no, which is something that happens to almost everyone at least once, and which is survivable?" Sarah looked at her. "You're conflating the outcome with something it isn't," Jess said. No doesn't mean you were wrong to ask. It might mean the timing was wrong, or the budget was wrong, or you need to make a clearer case. But not asking definitely means you don't get it. Sarah made the appointment with her manager the following week. She had prepared. She had gathered her evidence, specific achievements, measurable contributions, the market rate for her role in comparable companies, which she had researched with the thoroughness of someone who had spent 4 months avoiding a conversation and had finally decided to approach it properly. She presented these things. She stated the number she wanted. She did not apologize for stating it. Her manager had listened. He had said he needed to check the budget and would come back to her by the end of the week. The end of the week arrived. He came back to her with a number that was not what she had asked for and was more than she was currently earning. They agreed on it. She called Jess. "I got a raise," she said. "Of course you did," Jess said. "You asked." Story 5. The business that almost wasn't. The cafe had almost not happened several times before it happened. The first time it almost didn't happen was when Leon found the premises, and the premises were exactly right, and the rent was exactly wrong. Not impossible, but requiring more than he had, which required investors, which required conversations he had been avoiding because he was not sure his idea was ready to be tested by a conversation. He had the conversations. 2 of the people he spoke to said no. 1 said yes. The yes was enough. The second time the cafe almost didn't happen was during the renovation, when a problem was found in the electrical wiring that cost considerably more to fix than the survey had suggested, and the budget that had been tight became very tight, and Leon sat in the half-finished space on a Tuesday evening and thought seriously about whether to continue. He continued. The third time it almost didn't happen was 1 week before opening, when his head chef, who he had recruited carefully and who was excellent, took a job at another restaurant for reasons that were her own and not unreasonable. Leon spent 48 hours in a state of sustained panic before finding a solution that was not ideal and turned out, over the following months, to be better than the original plan in ways he could not have predicted. The cafe opened on a Thursday in October. It was not full on the first day. By the second week, it was finding its rhythm. By the third month, it was consistently busy at lunch and on weekend mornings, which were the times that mattered. Leon had been asked, in the 2 years since, whether he had known it would work. He said, "No, I thought it might work. I thought the idea was good and the location was right, and I had done as much preparation as I knew how to do, but I didn't know." "Was that frightening?" the person asked. "Yes," he said, "but I think I had decided that being frightened was allowed, as long as I kept going anyway. The goal was always the cafe. I just had to keep making decisions in the direction of the goal, even when I couldn't see the outcome. The cafe was still open. It was, by any measure that mattered to Leon, working. This was not a given. He knew other people who had tried similar things and for whom it had not worked. And the difference between his story and theirs was not entirely, or even mostly, about skill or effort. Some of it was timing and luck and the particular way things had fallen. He tried to remember this, that the success was partly his and partly a set of circumstances he had not entirely controlled, and that remembering this made him less arrogant about it and more grateful. Story 6. What she gave up. For 2 years, Maya drove a car that she could not afford, and which she knew she could not afford, and which she drove anyway because she had bought it in a different financial moment, and the gap between the moment of purchase and the present had narrowed in ways she had not anticipated. She did not talk about this. This was the thing about money problems that she had not expected. Not the problems themselves, which were stressful but manageable, but the silence around them, the particular effort of maintaining a version of yourself that did not include the true picture of your finances, the energy that effort required. She sold the car in the end. This was the obvious move, and she had known it for 8 months before she made it. The 8 months were not quite wasted. She had used them to work up to the decision, which required a particular kind of facing it that she was not naturally fast at. She sold the car, bought a much cheaper and much older one, and put what was left toward the credit card. The credit card took a further 14 months. When it was paid off, the last payment, on a Monday morning, she felt something that was not quite celebration and was more like putting down a weight she had been carrying in such a specific and accustomed way that she had stopped noticing it until it was gone. She told her sister, who was the only person who had known. "How do you feel?" her sister said. "Like I can breathe properly," Maya said, which sounds dramatic, but it's accurate. What she had learned over those 2 years was a set of things she could not have learned any other way. She had learned what she actually needed versus what she had thought she needed. She had learned the particular clarity that came from having no financial room, the way it simplified decisions, removed options, concentrated the mind. She had learned that the version of herself she had been maintaining for the cost of the car was not a version she especially liked. The new version, smaller car, better budget, the ongoing modest but real satisfaction of the numbers making sense, was, she found, a version she preferred. This was not a lesson she had wanted to learn this way, but it was, she thought, a lesson worth having. Story 7. The Inheritance. The money came from his grandfather, who had died in February, and it was more than Daniel had expected. He had expected something. His grandfather had been careful with money in the way of a person who had lived through a time when being careful was a necessity rather than a virtue, and he had saved consistently throughout his life. But the amount that came to Daniel via the will was more than he had anticipated, and he sat with the bank statement for a long time on a Wednesday afternoon, trying to understand what he was going to do. He had debts. The responsible thing, the obvious thing, was to pay the debts. He had also had, for several years, an idea that he had not been able to afford to pursue, which the money now made possible. These two things were in competition, and the competition was not comfortable. He spoke to a financial advisor, which he had never done before, which was mildly embarrassing and enormously useful. The financial advisor was a woman named Helen who asked clear questions and received his answers without judgment, and laid out the situation with a directness that he appreciated. The debts were real and had an interest rate attached to them, and the interest rate was the reason to prioritize them. The idea could be pursued after, with what remained and what he could save going forward. This was not what he wanted to hear, and it was the correct advice. He paid the debts. What remained was less than what he had started with, but was still something, a foundation, a beginning. He put some of it aside with the intention he had originally had, toward the idea, toward the thing he had been wanting to try. The thing he had been wanting to try was a recording studio, very small, rented time to musicians and podcasters and audio producers, specifically in his city, which had a gap in its provision. This was a calculated idea. He had done the research. He had not done it yet because the capital had not been there, and now, in reduced form but still meaningfully, it was. He did it the following year. The studio took another year to reach profitability. It reached it. He thought about his grandfather sometimes, in the studio, a man who had saved quietly and consistently for decades without knowing exactly what the money would eventually do, who had been careful not because he expected a particular outcome, but because carefulness was what he had decided to be. The carefulness had carried forward, in this specific and unplanned way, into something his grandfather would not have imagined and would, Daniel thought, have been pleased about. Story 8. The Comparison. The problem, Kate had decided, was comparison. Or rather, the comparison was the symptom, and the problem was something underneath it. She had a friend, a school friend, still close, genuinely liked, who was doing better financially than Kate. This was not a controversial statement of fact, just a fact. Her friend owned a house. Her friend had a job that paid more. Her friend was able to say yes to things without calculating first. Kate liked her friend. Kate also, she had admitted to herself after some effort, occasionally resented her friend, which she found unpleasant to notice and was trying to look at without flinching. The resentment was not about the friend, really. The friend had not done anything wrong. What the resentment was about, when Kate sat with it quietly and traced it back, was the gap itself, and what the gap made her feel about her own life, her own choices, her own progress. It made her feel behind. And feeling behind made her feel a particular anxiety that she had not, until recently, named. She had gone into a profession she loved. The profession did not pay well. This had been a known fact when she entered it, and had remained a known fact throughout, and she had made a series of choices in full knowledge of it, and she stood by those choices. But standing by a choice and being completely free of its costs were different things. The cost, here, was occasional and specific, the ache of comparison when it came. She talked to her partner about it. Her partner listened carefully and said something she had not expected. "Do you want the life your friend has, or do you want to feel less like you're missing something?" She looked at him, What's the difference? One means you need to change direction. The other means you need to find a different way to think about the direction you're already in. Kate thought about this for a long time. She thought about the friend's life, specific and real, not an abstraction. The house, the salary, the things that came with them. She thought about her own life. She thought about what she would give up. She would not give up the work. That was the answer she found when she looked at it honestly. She would not trade the work for the salary, which meant the comparison was a habit of thought rather than a genuine desire for something different. She did not stop noticing the gap, but she started noticing it differently, as a piece of information about how she was thinking, rather than a verdict on how she was doing. This was, she found, more useful. Story 9. The Budget Holiday. They had decided, the summer before last, that they would have a real holiday, a proper one, not a weekend somewhere nearby, but an actual week away in another country, with the sun and the food and the general quality of being somewhere that was not the place they spent every day. The budget was limited. This was the context. They were not in a position to be careless about it, and they had agreed, before they started planning, to be honest about what they could spend and to plan within that number, rather than adjusting the number to fit the plan. This turned out to be, in itself, an exercise in communication. The first conversation about where to go had produced a kind of cheerful impasse. He wanted mountains, she was not opposed to mountains but wanted water, and the two were not entirely incompatible but required some negotiation. They looked at maps. They found a place that had both, a lake in the mountains of a country neither of them had visited, and felt the specific satisfaction of a solution that was better than either of the original proposals. They booked flights that were not convenient times but were the affordable times, and they rented a small apartment rather than a hotel, which was cheaper and turned out to be better, because it had a kitchen and a terrace and the particular independence of a space that was temporarily yours. The week was not expensive. This was what they kept saying to people afterward, which was true and which people seemed to find slightly surprising, as if a good holiday required a large expenditure, as if budget and enjoyment were necessarily in tension. What they spent money on, food, eaten mostly at local places rather than tourist restaurants, which required a little effort to find and was consistently worth it. Boat trips, a long hike with a guide who knew the paths and knew the birds, one very good dinner on the last night that was more than they had spent on any other dinner that week, and that was the right thing to spend money on. What they did not spend money on, souvenirs, which they had both independently decided they did not want. Expensive hotels, taxis when walking was possible. It was the best holiday we've had, she said afterward, which was accurate. Because of the budget, he said. Because of the lake, she said, and the mountains. But partly because of the budget. We chose carefully. Everything we did, we chose. Story 10. The Side Project. For 3 years, Sam had been working on something in the evenings. The something was an app, a tool for musicians to manage their touring logistics, a problem he had identified from his own years playing in bands, a problem that no existing product solved in the way he thought it should be solved. He was a software developer by profession and a musician by calling, and the combination meant he had the skills to try. He had not told many people. He had told his partner, who was supportive in the practical way of someone who has learned to let a person do what they need to do. He had told 2 friends who were also musicians, whose feedback was useful and who he used as early testers. He had not told his employer, which felt like the right call, Not because there was a conflict, but because he did not want the thing to be observed until it was ready to be seen. The evenings were, after a full day of work, not his best hours. He knew this. He worked in them anyway, in the hour or two between dinner and bed, when the mind was slower but still capable, and on weekend mornings when the time was cleaner. Progress was not linear. There were weeks when something complicated became clear, and the work moved fast, and the satisfaction was enormous. There were weeks when he could not solve a problem he had been working on for too long, and the project sat untouched for 3 days, because he needed the distance. The app had been downloaded by 83 people when Sam looked at the numbers one Sunday morning and thought, that is 83 people who found it useful enough to try. 83 was not many. It was also not nothing, and it was real, and the 83 had found it without advertising, without a marketing budget, without anything except the quiet and specific fact that the tool existed and solved a problem that existed. He had not made money from it. He had not set out to. The goal had been simpler and was, he thought, sufficient: to make a thing that he believed should exist, and to find out if it was as useful as he believed. The 83 people were the answer. Whether it became more than that, whether it grew, whether it became something economically significant, was a question he had decided not to answer yet. For now, it was enough to have built the thing, and to have the thing work, and to have 83 people using it in the quiet and ordinary way of people who use tools that help them without thinking much about where the tools came from. He thought about that. He thought about all the things he used every day that someone had made, in evenings, somewhere, for reasons that were not purely financial. He was glad those people had made their things. He hoped, in some small measure, to be one of them. Story 11. Enough. The question of how much was enough had taken Elena a long time to answer, partly because she had spent most of her 20s and 30s pursuing more before she stopped to ask the question at all. More was what you were supposed to want. More was the direction you were supposed to be moving in. She had moved in it diligently. Better job, better salary, better title, the next thing and the next. Each level of income making possible a slightly larger version of the life she was building. She had been, by any conventional measure, successful. She was 40 when the question arrived. Not as a crisis, not as a collapse, just as a question, surfacing one morning while she was getting ready for work. Is this the right amount of effort to spend on this particular goal? She sat with the question. It was uncomfortable. It did not have an obvious answer. More as a direction was simple. It always pointed the same way. Enough required a measurement, and the measurement required knowing what she was measuring for, and knowing what she was measuring for required a kind of honesty that was harder than ambition. What she wanted, when she looked at it, time. She wanted more time. Not time off, exactly. She did not want to stop working, but time that was hers, unaccounted for, not productive in the narrow sense of the word. Time for the things that did not appear on any metric. The long walk, the unhurried morning, the book read in the afternoon without guilt, the cooking of a dinner that took 2 hours and produced something worth the 2 hours. She made changes slowly. She turned down a promotion that would have paid more and demanded more. She took on fewer high-urgency projects and more of the kind she found genuinely interesting. Her income did not drop dramatically. Her hours did. What she found, in the year after the changes, was that the life was more hers. Not bigger, not more impressive from the outside, but more inhabited from the inside. People asked her, occasionally, why she had turned down the promotion. She had a short answer and a long answer. The short answer was, the timing wasn't right. The long answer, which she gave to people she trusted, people who were genuinely asking, was about enough. About the question of what enough meant, and the effort it took to answer it honestly, and how much had changed for her when she finally did. Story 12. The Dream. When people asked Theo what he wanted to do with his life, he said architecture. He had been saying it since he was 11. It had survived school and had become, at 19, the thing he pursued with a seriousness that architecture school required, and that not everyone who arrived there with the same dream had. The degree was 5 years. The early years of practice were long and not well paid. He had known this before he started. He started anyway. He was 31 when he completed his professional qualification. He had been working toward it for 12 years. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, and he read it in his kitchen and sat down and looked at the wall for a while without doing anything in particular. He called his parents. He called his best friend. He went for a long walk in the city, his city, the one he lived in and knew and loved in the specific way of someone who notices buildings. And he looked at the buildings. He looked at the way light fell across a facade. He looked at the relationship between a structure and the space around it. He thought about what it had taken to become the person who could look at those things with that knowledge. The dream had been, for 12 years, the thing he was becoming. Now he was it. He was the thing he had wanted to be. This was both simpler and larger than he had expected it to feel. Someone had said to him in his first year of architecture school that the goal was not really the degree or the qualification, that those were checkpoints. The goal was to become the kind of person who could think in a certain way, who could see things that needed to be built and understand how to build them. The goal was the competence, the knowledge, the way of seeing. The qualification was just the acknowledgement. He had thought about this often, over the 12 years. He thought about it on the walk. He had the qualification now. He had also, somewhere along the 12 years, become the person who could look at a building and understand it. And that was the other thing, the thing underneath the qualification, that had been the actual work. He stopped in front of a building he had walked past many times before. He stood and looked at it for several minutes, unhurried. A woman passing gave him a slightly curious look. He didn't notice. He was an architect looking at a building. This was, it turned out, what he had always wanted to be. Story 8. The Savings Account. She had opened a savings account at 23 with £50 and had added to it whenever she could for the next several years. The adding was not always possible. There were months when everything was spent before the month ended, and the savings account sat unchanged. She had trained herself not to treat these months as failures. They were months in which the buffer had been needed, or in which the money had genuinely not existed. The account was there for when things were better. She had used the savings twice, once for a car repair she could not have managed otherwise, and once for a period of reduced work that had been partly chosen and partly forced. Both times the account had meant the crisis was not a crisis. The car repair was expensive and manageable. The period of reduced income was difficult and survivable. She had rebuilt the account after each use, more slowly the second time. She had thought about money differently after the rebuilding, not as a thing to accumulate for its own sake, but as the material condition of having options. The savings account was options. It was the ability to say no to a bad situation, the ability to say yes to a sudden opportunity, the ability to absorb a shock without it changing everything. She kept adding to it whenever she could. This had become, over the years, simply what you did. Story 9. The Budget. He had resisted making a budget for most of his adult life, and when he made one, he had found it less terrible than he expected. The resistance had been to the visibility. He had not wanted to see what was happening, because seeing it would require responding to it. The not seeing had been, for a long time, more comfortable than the knowledge. The budget had shown him things he had suspected and things he had not. The suspected things confirmed the patterns he had been vaguely aware of. The things he had not suspected were useful in a different way. They were the quiet drains, the subscriptions and habits that had established themselves and been forgotten, that taken together were significant. He had not found the budget demoralizing, which he had expected. He had found it oddly settling. The thing he had been afraid to see was not as bad as the fear of seeing it, and having seen it, he could do something with it. The not seeing had not protected him from the situation. It had only removed his ability to act on it. He adjusted things where he could. He watched the budget. He found gradually that knowing what was happening gave him more room than not knowing had, because the room was real rather than illusory. Story 10. The Windfall. She had received an unexpected amount of money, not a large amount in the scale of wealth, but larger than anything she had received before, and she had sat with it for 3 months before deciding what to do with it. The sitting with it had been important. Her first instincts had been several different things at once, and she had learned, when money arrived unexpectedly, that the first instincts were not always the right ones. She had sat with it. At the end of the 3 months, she had divided it, some to the savings account, some to the debt she had been slowly paying off, some to the thing she had wanted to do for 2 years and had put off for the lack of a certain sum. The proportions had felt right after the 3 months, in a way they might not have felt in the first week. She had not told many people about the windfall. Money had a way of generating opinions in other people about what you should do with it, and she had not wanted to navigate the opinions until she had her own idea. By the time she was ready to talk about it, the decision was already made, and the opinions could be received without the decision being complicated by them. Story 11. The Debt. He had spent 4 years paying off a debt that had felt, at the beginning, like a stone around his neck, and the paying off had taught him things he wished he had known before the debt. The debt had been acquired in a period when he was not paying attention in the way he should have been. Not from extravagance exactly, from the accumulation of small failures to attend, the gradual drift between what was coming in and what was going out. By the time he noticed the drift, it had become the debt. He had made a plan. The plan was simple, slightly more going out each month toward the debt than the debt was costing him. Not dramatically more. He could not manage dramatically more. Just more. Consistently, month after month. The 4 years had required consistency more than sacrifice. He had not given up large things. He had given up small things, repeatedly, and had kept giving them up when he would have preferred not to. The consistency was harder than the individual decisions. At the end of the 4 years, the debt was gone. He had felt something he had not expected. Not triumph exactly, but a quiet solidity. The stone was gone. He stood differently without it. He had no intention of acquiring the stone again. He had also, in the 4 years, acquired the knowledge that he could handle the thing that had felt unmanageable, that the plan and the consistency, unglamorous as they were, worked. This knowledge was worth something beyond the absence of the debt. Story 12. The Goal She Didn't Reach. She had set a goal for herself at 31 and had not reached it by the date she had set, and this had been instructive. The goal was financial, and had been ambitious in a way she had not fully understood at the time of setting it. She had looked at it from the outside, the number, the date, and had felt it was achievable. She had not built a path from where she was to where she wanted to be. She had simply identified the destination and assumed the path would develop. The date arrived. She was closer than she had been, but not where she had aimed to be. She had thought about what had happened. The goal had not been wrong. The date had been wrong, or more precisely, she had not understood how long the path was from the setting to the achieving. She had set the date with optimism rather than with the arithmetic. She revised. She did the arithmetic this time. The actual amounts, the actual pace, the actual time this would take at a realistic rate. The new date was further out and less exciting than the original. It was also accurate. She reached the revised goal. It had taken the full time the arithmetic had suggested. She had found in the reaching that the unglamorous revised timeline had been more useful than the ambitious original. Achievable goals, reached, were worth more than ambitious goals missed. Story 13. The raise she asked for. She had asked for a raise and been given one, and the asking had been the hardest part. She had prepared for the conversation for 3 weeks. She had written down her contributions and their outcomes. She had researched what people in comparable roles were paid. She had rehearsed the conversation with a friend who was good at this kind of thing and who had given her the useful advice. Say the number first. Don't explain it before you say it. Say it. She had said the number. Her manager had looked at the number and had not looked surprised, which she had not expected, and which told her something. They had discussed it. The outcome was not the number she had asked for, but closer to it than her current salary. She had spent 3 years before the asking not asking, because she had told herself that good work was noticed and rewarded without the asking. She had learned that good work was a precondition for the raise, not the mechanism. The mechanism was the conversation. The conversation required the asking. She had been afraid of the asking because she had not known how the conversation would go. She had found, on the other side of it, that the conversation was manageable and the outcome was an improvement, and the only cost had been 3 weeks of preparation and the brief discomfort of saying the number. She told other people this. Ask, prepare, and ask. Story 14. The investment. He had put money into something he did not fully understand, and it had not gone well, and this had taught him something he tried not to learn expensively twice. The investment had been recommended by someone he trusted, which was how he had ended up in it. He had trusted the person and had not done his own research, because the trust had stood in for the research. This was the error. He had lost the money slowly and then all at once, in the way of these things, and by the time it was lost, it was clear that he should have understood what he was putting money into before he put it in. He was not angry at the person who had recommended it. The person had not deceived him. The person had put their own money into the same thing. They had both not understood it well enough, and the market had had its way with both of them. He had learned several things. He learned that trust was not research. He learned that he should not put money into anything he could not explain simply. He learned that the money he invested should be money he could afford to lose, because sometimes it was lost. He applied these lessons. They were not exciting lessons. He had paid an unwelcome amount for them. He did not intend to pay again. Story 15. The year she lived small. She had chosen to live on less for a year, not from necessity but from intention, to see what it was like and to free up something for a specific future purpose. The year had been different from what she expected. She had expected it to feel like deprivation, and it had felt, mostly, like clarity. She had found, removing the things she had been spending money on, that some had been missed and many had not. The ones that had not been missed were information. The restaurants she had reduced were missed. The subscriptions she had canceled were not. The clothes she had stopped buying were not. The weekend trips she had postponed were missed. The coffees at the office she had replaced with coffee from home were not. She had come out of the year with a picture of what she actually valued versus what she had been spending money on by habit or convenience or ambient pressure. The picture was not always what she would have predicted before the year. She had also accumulated a significant amount, over the year, toward the specific purpose. The purpose was a course of study she had been putting off, and at the end of the year she enrolled. The year of living small had bought her the next thing. This seemed, on reflection, a reasonable exchange. Story 16. The Financial Conversation. She had never talked about money with her parents, and then she had, and it had changed things. The conversation had been her initiation. She had asked them, at a point in their lives when the question was becoming relevant, what the situation was. She had been afraid of the question and more afraid of not knowing. She had asked. The answer was more complicated than she had expected, and also more manageable. She had learned things she should have known and had formed a clearer picture of what was coming, at some point, and what it would require. She had felt, after the conversation, that she could plan rather than dread. Her parents had also seemed relieved. She had not anticipated this. They had been carrying the information and the worry about the information, and having someone to carry it with had lightened something. She thought about how many families did not have this conversation until it was forced upon them by a crisis, and how much easier the crisis was to navigate when the landscape had been understood in advance. She had been one of those families until she wasn't, and the change was worth the discomfort of asking. Story 17. The Goal That Changed. She had been working toward a goal for 3 years when the goal had changed, and she had had to decide what to do about the 3 years. The goal was to buy a flat in a particular city, and she had been saving toward it steadily, and the market in that city had moved in a way that made the original goal unrecognizable. What she would have been able to buy 3 years ago, she could no longer afford. The city had changed around the goal. She had been angry about this for a while, which was understandable and which did not help. She had then had to decide whether to continue toward the same goal with a longer timeline or to change the goal. She had changed the goal. She had looked at what was achievable in a different place, a smaller city further from the center, different in the ways she had not originally wanted, and had found that the achievable thing was genuinely good, even if it was not the original thing. She had moved the savings toward the new goal. The 3 years were not lost. The saving had happened, the money existed, the discipline had been built, the destination had changed, the preparation had not. She thought about this sometimes when she looked at what she had achieved. She had not achieved the original goal. She had achieved something different that was also good. The achievement looked different from what she had imagined. It was still an achievement. Story 18. The Colleague's Question. He had asked his colleague, older, further along, what she wished she had known about money in her 30s. The colleague had thought for a moment and had said, "I wish I had understood that every delay costs twice." She had explained, the cost of waiting to start saving was not just the time you lost, it was the time you lost compounded. The delay was its own expense, and the expense grew the longer the delay continued. She had said something else. I wish I had taken fewer financial decisions out of fear. She had avoided certain things because she was afraid of doing them wrong, and the avoidance had been its own version of wrong. Acting imperfectly was usually better than not acting. He had thanked her. He had thought about what she said for a long time. He had started several things he had been delaying, in the imperfect way she had described. He had found that the imperfect starting was better than the continuing to wait, in the way she had said it would be. He had passed the question on to younger colleagues years later. He had told them what the colleague had told him, because the information still seemed worth passing on. Story 19. What money was for. She had spent a long time relating to money as a score, a number that reflected how well she was doing, which should be increased, and which decreasing felt like failure. She had come to relate to it differently. The money was for things, not just any things, the things that actually mattered in the living of her life. The question was not how to increase the number, but how to make the number useful in the ways that were specific to her. This reframing had changed her relationship with spending. She had stopped feeling vaguely guilty about spending money on things she valued, and feeling vaguely good about not spending money on things she didn't. She had started asking, is this money doing what I need money to do? The things she needed money to do were provide security, fund the experiences she valued, enable the life she wanted to live, reduce the cost of things she did not want to spend time on. These were real purposes. The money was the means to them. She was not cavalier. The security mattered and she funded it. But she had stopped treating frugality as a virtue in itself and had started treating it as a tool, useful when it served the purposes, beside the point when it didn't. Story 20. The pension. He had started contributing to a pension at 24, reluctantly because someone had made him read one piece of information about compound growth, and the information had been sufficiently startling that he had started. He thought about this sometimes, the one piece of information. It had not been a long conversation. It had not been extensive advice. It had been one number. The difference between starting at 24 and starting at 34, over 40 years, given average market returns. The number was large enough that he had stopped procrastinating. He did not follow his pension particularly closely. He contributed, his employer contributed, and the thing grew in a way that was almost entirely outside his active attention. He checked it once a year or so. What he had learned from the pension was the value of decisions that worked in the background, without requiring ongoing effort. He had made the decision once, and it was still working. The habit was automated. The contribution was automatic. He did not have to remember or choose each month. He tried to find other places in his financial life where the same was possible: the automated saving, the direct payment, the thing set up to do the right thing without requiring him to choose the right thing repeatedly. The repeating of choices was where things went wrong, he had found. The right setup reduced the opportunities for wrong choices. Story 21. The Emergency Fund. She had built an emergency fund over 2 years and used it twice and rebuilt it both times, and it had changed her relationship with risk. Before the fund, unexpected costs had been crises: the car, the appliance, the unexpected bill that required rearranging everything. After the fund, they were problems. Not pleasant, but manageable. The fund absorbed them. What she had not anticipated was the effect on her general anxiety. She had not known she was anxious about money until the fund existed and the anxiety had, without announcement, reduced. The fund was not very large. It was not a life-changing sum, but it was enough to handle the category of things that had previously been crises, and the knowledge of this had changed something in the background of her daily life. She thought about this when people asked whether an emergency fund was worth the time it took to build. She said, "Yes, and not only for the reasons you expect. The fund itself is worth it. The way you feel once it exists is also worth it. These are two separate benefits, and both are real." Story 22. The Small Goal. He had set himself a goal that was, by any financial standard, very small. He had wanted to pay for a particular trip in cash from savings without debt. The trip cost £800. He had given himself a year. He had reached it in 10 months. He had taken the trip. The trip was good. The way the trip felt, having been saved for in this specific way, was also good. Different from trips he had taken that had gone on a card, somehow more fully enjoyed for being already paid. He could not have explained exactly why. He had started setting small goals after this. Not large long-term targets, but specific achievable ones with clear endings. This thing, by this date, for this purpose. The specificity helped. He was saving for something he could picture, which was more motivating than saving in the abstract. He had found, over several years of small goals met, that the practice of meeting them had changed the practice of setting them. He knew now what was realistic. He knew his pace. He could look at a goal and see approximately how long it would take. The accuracy of the seeing was itself a kind of confidence. Story 23. Enough to be comfortable. She had spent a long time wanting more than she had, and then she had had more, and she had found that it did not resolve the wanting in the way she had expected. This was not a story about the uselessness of money. Money had made specific things better. The security was real. The options were real. The absence of certain stresses was real. These were improvements, and she did not understate them. The thing that had not changed was the comparative sense, the awareness of what she didn't have, the vague dissatisfaction with the current amount relative to some undefined higher amount. More money had not resolved this because the wanting was not primarily about money. It was about something else that money could not buy, and which she had had to find elsewhere. She had found it, imperfectly, in the practice of knowing what was enough for her specifically. Not enough in the abstract, which was always more. Enough for the life she was actually living, the things she needed to do, the things she wanted to do. When she could name those things, the current amount was often enough. When she could not, no amount was. Story 24. The career that changed the numbers. She had changed careers at 38, and the change had been good in many ways, and one of the ways it had been good was financial. She had not expected this. The conventional wisdom about career changes was that they cost money, and in the short term this had been true. The retraining, the period of lower income, the time between the old career and the new one, these had been costly. But the new career was one she was better at and more motivated by, and the combination meant she had done it better and advanced more quickly than she had in the career she had been in from obligation. Within 5 years, she was earning significantly more than she had been. Within 10 years, more than she had imagined. She did not think the financial outcome was the point of the change. She had changed for other reasons, and the finances had followed from the change. But she had found that the advice to stay in a financially safer career, which she had heard from several people, had been wrong in her case. The financially safer thing had been to go into the work she was actually suited for. This was specific to her situation. She did not offer it as general advice. She offered it as evidence that the choice was more complicated than it appeared from the outside, and that the outcome of following your inclination was not always as financially costly as the conventional wisdom suggested. Story 25. The Comparison Problem. He had spent several years comparing his financial situation to people around him, and had found this consistently miserable, and had stopped. The comparison was miserable for the obvious reasons. There was always someone doing better by whatever measure he was using, and finding that person was effortless because they were everywhere, and finding them reliably made him feel behind. Behind what? He had not been able to answer this clearly. Behind some imaginary trajectory that he had not set for himself but had absorbed from somewhere. He had replaced the comparison with a different question. Am I better positioned than I was a year ago? This question was answerable, and the answer was usually yes, because he had been doing the things that moved things in the right direction, slowly. The yes was not exciting, but it was reliable and it was true. The comparison had also been unfair in the way of most comparisons. He was comparing his full situation to other people's visible situations, which were curated toward the best version. He was comparing his inside knowledge, including the difficulties and anxieties, to their outside presentation. This comparison was not between equivalent things, and the conclusions it produced were not valid. He spent the energy he had been spending on comparison on his own direction instead. He found it more useful. Story 26. The course she paid for. She had spent a significant amount on a course that was, by the standards of what she normally spent, a large investment in herself, and she had found it hard to justify, and had done it anyway. The difficulty in justifying it was not the amount, exactly. She could afford the amount. It was the sense that spending on herself in this particular way, learning, growing, developing, was somehow less legitimate than other categories of spending. She had spent similar amounts without difficulty on other things, and had balked at this. She had unpicked this. She had found that the balking was about a belief that she had not examined, that investment in her own development was a kind of selfishness, or an indulgence, or something that required more justification than spending on other people or on concrete practical things. The belief was not true. She examined it and could not defend it, and did not keep it. She took the course. It was good. It changed how she did the thing it had been about, which led to outcomes she could trace. The return on the investment was visible, in retrospect, in ways she had not known to predict when she spent the money. She had found, having taken it, that the hardest part had been giving herself permission to invest in herself. The investment itself had been the easy part. Story 27. The Money Conversation. She had started talking about money with her friends, and had found the talking changed her understanding of her own situation. Not because her friends gave her advice. She had not been looking for advice. But because the context of hearing other people's situations had given her a more accurate picture of her own. She had not known what was normal, what was possible, what other people actually did. The silence around money had kept her in the dark about all of this. The conversations had been tentative at first. She had raised the topic carefully and found that the careful raising was received with relief. That other people had also been carrying their financial situations in silence and had also been waiting for permission to talk about them. They did not share exact numbers, mostly. They talked in approximations and directions. Things were tight. Things were better than they had been. A particular decision had worked out or hadn't. This was enough to be useful. It gave her comparators and context, and the sense that she was not navigating alone. She thought about why money was so hard to talk about. She thought it was related to the conflation of money with worth, as if the numbers in the account said something about the value of the person. They did not. She knew they did not, and yet the taboo remained, even in the knowing. She kept the conversations going. They were worth having. Story 28. The number she was afraid of. She had been afraid to look at the number for almost a year. The number was how much she owed, in total, across the various things she owed it on. She had known approximately. She had not wanted to know exactly, because exactly felt heavier than approximately, and she was already carrying the approximately with some difficulty. She had looked at the number. She had sat with it for an afternoon. The number was bad. She did not minimize this. It was more than she had allowed herself to fully believe, and knowing the exact amount was worse than not knowing in the immediate term, because she now had to hold the exact thing rather than the approximate thing. And then something had shifted. She had the number. She knew the terrain. She could make a plan from an actual number in a way she could not make a plan from an approximate one. The not knowing had protected her from the immediate discomfort and had prevented her from acting. She made the plan. She began. The number began, slowly, to decrease. She looked at it now, the decreasing number, with different feelings than she had had when she was afraid to look. The fear of the number had been larger than the number. This was almost always true, she thought, about the things people were afraid to know. Story 29. The salary negotiation. She had negotiated her salary exactly once in her first decade of working, and then she had started doing it every time, and the difference between the two approaches had been significant. The first decade of not negotiating was based on the belief that the offer was what it was, that negotiating was somehow inappropriate, that the employer would resent it, that asking for more was presumptuous. She had held these beliefs without examining them, and they had cost her, conservatively, a meaningful amount across the decade. She had examined them when a friend told her what she had negotiated for an equivalent role. The gap had been uncomfortable to look at. She had started negotiating from the next offer. What she had found was that negotiating was expected, that the initial offer was a starting point, not a fixed thing, and that most employers did not resent it. They had a range. The offer was at the bottom of the range. You could ask for more. They would often give it. The discomfort of asking lasted approximately 3 minutes. The improved salary lasted until the next negotiation. She told every younger person she worked with, negotiate, research the range, know your worth, say the number. The discomfort is temporary. The outcome of not asking is permanent. Story 30. The long horizon. He had given himself a long horizon when he was 30 and had found that having a long horizon changed the short-term decisions. The horizon was simple. At 65, he wanted to have the option of working less. Not necessarily to stop. He did not know what he would want at 65, having never been there, but to have the option. The option required money. The money required saving over a long time. The long time had already started. He had found, having set the horizon, that the intermediate decisions were easier. The question of whether to spend or save was answerable by reference to the horizon. Does this choice move me toward or away from it? The question was not always decisive. Sometimes you needed to spend, sometimes the present was worth investing in, but it was useful as a framework. He was 52 now. The horizon was getting closer. He could see, from here, that the decisions he had made at 30 and 40 and 50 had put him in a position that the 30-year-old him would have been pleased with. not finished, not able to stop, but positioned. The options were more open at 52 than they had been at 30, which was what the horizon had been for. He thought about what he would tell the 30-year-old him. He would say, "The horizon is worth setting. The decisions you make in the first half will determine the freedom you have in the second. Start earlier than you think you need to." Story 31. What goals are for? She had come, over the years of setting goals and reaching some and missing others, to a useful understanding of what goals were actually for. They were not, she had found, primarily for the achievement. The achievement was good. The arrival at the thing was satisfying. But the goal's main function was in what it did to the direction of attention, in the way it oriented the everyday decisions. A goal was a commitment to look in a particular direction, not every day, not obsessively, but when a decision arose, this or that, now or later, save or spend, the goal was what you checked the decision against. This checking was the mechanism by which the goal was achieved. The goal was the referent. The daily decisions were the actual work. She had had goals she was serious about and goals she was not. And the difference was exactly this: whether the goal was doing the work of orienting her decisions. When it was, things moved. When it wasn't, the goal was a wish, which was a different thing. She tried now to only set goals she was serious about. The number of them was smaller than it had been. The number she reached was higher. She thought this was approximately the right trade. Story 32. The month that taught her. There had been a month, she could still identify the year, the general period, when the money had run out before the month did. Not from catastrophe, from the accumulation of slightly wrong decisions made across 30 days, none of which would have been disqualifying alone, but which together had arrived at a week of very careful management. She had eaten what was in the cupboard. She had not spent on anything that was not necessary. She had waited for the month to end. She had not told anyone at the time. She was embarrassed, which she later recognized was common and also unnecessary. The situation was not unusual and was not a reflection of her fundamental character. But at the time, the embarrassment had been real. She had learned things from the month. She had learned more specifically what her minimum was, what it actually cost to live for 30 days when everything was reduced to its essentials. She had learned that the essentials were fewer than she had assumed, and that she could manage them with more care than she had previously applied. She had also learned that she needed a buffer, a month of expenses sitting available, so that the month's income not arriving on exactly the right day was manageable rather than a crisis. She had built the buffer. It had taken 8 months. She had never had that week again. Story 33. The generous person. She had known someone who was genuinely generous with money, and the thing that had struck her was that they were not particularly wealthy. The generosity was not about abundance. It was about orientation. The person's relationship with what they had was simply different. They held their money lightly, in the sense that it did not occasion stress or calculation when an occasion for generosity arose. They gave when they saw the opportunity, and they did not make an accounting of the giving. She had asked once, "How do you think about giving?" The person had thought about this. She had said, "I try to give what I can without leaving myself short, and when I've done that, I stop worrying about it." She had added, "The giving makes me feel good. It's not sacrifice. I like doing it." This seemed to her like the resolution of a tension she had not managed to resolve, between taking care of herself and taking care of others. The person had found a calibration that served both, and had done so without much drama. She had tried to import the orientation. She had not fully managed it. She was less calculating about it than she had been. She was working on the lightness. Story 34. The last story. What he had learned, across the years of earning and spending and saving and planning, was that money was a secondary thing. Not unimportant. He would not say unimportant. The absence of money was a real condition with real effects, and the presence of it was a real condition with real effects. These were not the same, and the difference mattered. But money was secondary to the life it was in service of. The question was always, what is the money for? What does it make possible? What, without it, would be missing? When he could answer those questions specifically, when he knew what the money was for, he found the money easier to manage and easier to accumulate. He was saving towards something. He was spending on things that served the life. The money had direction. When he had treated the money as an end in itself, when the goal had been the number rather than the things the number enabled, he had found that the number was never satisfying. More always seemed needed, less always seemed threatening. The life was the thing. The money was what made the life possible. In that order, things made sense. In the other order, nothing ever quite settled. He had come to this understanding slowly and imperfectly, and it was still being refined. He thought it was the right understanding. He tried to live accordingly. Story 35. The Values Test. She had found a useful test for financial decisions. Does this spending reflect what I actually value, or what I think I should value? The distinction was, she had found, more important than it sounded. She had spent money on many things over the years that she thought she should want. The gym membership that reflected a self-image she had not earned yet. The class that seemed like the kind of thing a person like her should do. The equipment for a hobby she had committed to in theory. The things she actually valued were different from the things she thought she should value, and the gap between them had cost her both money and the faint guilt of spending on the wrong things. She had come to know herself better, across the years, about what she actually valued. The home was important to her. Certain experiences were important, specific ones, not the category. The people she loved were important in ways that had financial implications. The things that were not important, the signaling, the appearance, the keeping up. She did not apply the test perfectly. She still sometimes spent on the should value rather than the actually value, but less often than she had. And the gap between the two had narrowed as she had gotten better at knowing what the actually value was. Story 36. Looking back. He had looked back, at 50, at the financial decisions of his 20s and 30s, and had found himself more sympathetic than he had expected. He had made choices that, from where he was now, appeared clearly wrong. He had not saved as much as he should have when saving was cheap. He had spent on things that had not mattered. He had been afraid of certain things that would have been beneficial. But he had made these choices without the information he now had. He had not known, at 25, what he knew at 50. He had been doing what seemed reasonable with the understanding available to him. The understanding had been incomplete. It always was in your 20s, and you couldn't have it more complete by wanting it. He had learned from the choices. The learning had been the appropriate consequence. He did not add to the learning a verdict about the person who had made the choices, because that person had been doing their best with what they had. He tried to look forward with the same equanimity. He was making decisions now that 50-year-older him would look back on, and some of them would be clearly wrong. He could only do his best with the understanding he currently had and try to make the understanding as good as possible before acting. Story 37. The Patient Money. She had learned, through experience she would have preferred not to have, that patient money beat impatient money almost every time. The impatient money was the money that wanted results quickly, the investment that was going to return fast, the opportunity that was too good to wait on, the decision that had to be made now before the chance was gone. She had made several impatient money decisions, and they had not gone well, in ways that were retrospectively predictable. The patient money was slower and less exciting. It was the consistent saving, the long-held investment, the decision that could be made in a week rather than today. It did not produce dramatic outcomes. It produced reliable ones, which over time were larger than the dramatic outcomes she had tried to manufacture through impatience. She had found that the urgency in financial decisions was usually artificial, that the thing that had to happen now could in fact happen next week, and the things that genuinely could not wait were rarer than they appeared. She had started to treat urgency as a signal to slow down rather than speed up, which was the opposite of what urgency commanded. This was difficult to practice. The urgency was persuasive even when she knew it was artificial. She was better at it than she had been. She was still working on it. Story 38, the last story. He had not thought of himself as a patient person, and the years of managing money had made him more patient, not by intention, but by necessity. Money required patience. The good versions of money required a lot of patience. The saving, the compounding, the long-held plan, the goal that arrived years after it was set. The impatient versions were faster and less reliable. He had been impatient and had learned. He had also found that the financial patience had bled into other areas. The practice of holding decisions, of not acting before the information was complete, of taking the long view, these had become available to him in other contexts because he had practiced them in the financial one. He did not think money was the most important thing. He had thought that once and no longer did. But he had found that how he managed money said things about how he managed other things, and that the improvements in one had tended to come with improvements in others. The money was the practice. The practice was what was worth having. Story 39, the revision. She had revised her financial goals every few years, which she had initially thought of as changing course, and had eventually come to think of as updating her understanding. The goals she had set at 25 were based on what she had known at 25. Limited knowledge of what she would want, incomplete information about what things cost, no direct experience of the way priorities shifted with time. The goals were not wrong. Exactly. They were based on the best available understanding. At 35, she had understood more. At 45, she understood more still. Each revision had incorporated the learning of the years since the last revision. She had stopped feeling guilty about the revision. The earlier goals had not been failures. They had been honest attempts that she had grown beyond. The current goals were honest attempts that she would, in another decade, have grown beyond. This was not inconsistency. It was the relationship between a growing understanding and an evolving life. She tried to hold her current goals with the same lightness, firm enough to act on, loose enough to revise when the understanding required it. And there we leave Theo on the pavement, looking at a building, 12 years in, finally where he always wanted to be. Money and goals are wound together in the way that most real things are. You cannot entirely separate them, and the interesting work is in the space where they meet, where you decide what the money is for, and what the goal is worth, and how much you are willing to give, and what you are not willing to give up. The people in tonight's stories made real choices, with real costs, and they did not all end up with everything they wanted. Some ended up with something better. Some ended up with something smaller and more honest. Some ended up with exactly what they had aimed for, which was its own kind of revelation. The revelation that arrival is not quite what you imagined, and also that it is real and yours. Thank you for spending tonight with these stories. Thank you for bringing your learning into your rest. The English has been moving through you this whole time, quiet, steady, doing its work. Please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Tell a friend. Leave a comment in the morning if something stayed with you. These simple things keep the channel going and keep us making more. Good night, rest well, and whatever you are working toward, keep going. We will see you next time.